She had 30 seconds before a man in a white coat killed a federal witness in a hospital bed. Emily Parker stood in the ICU corridor at 2:47 a.m., watching a stranger in scrubs move toward room 14 with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this before. He carried a syringe. He wore a badge that didn't belong to Harwick Memorial. He had hands that were too steady, too practiced, for someone making rounds at 3 in the morning. She had seen hands like that before, downrange, in places she didn't talk about anymore. "That man is not a doctor," she said. The charge nurse looked up from her station, glanced once at the hallway, and looked back at her screen. "Go finish your charting, Emily." Nobody moved, nobody listened. And the man in the white coat disappeared through the door of room 14. If you want to know what one woman with no weapon and no backup did next, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and subscribe. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night had started the way most nights started at Harwick Memorial Medical Center in the city of Caldwell, slow, understaffed, and smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and cold coffee. Emily Parker had been on shift since 7. It was now closing in on 3 in the morning, and she'd already dealt with a COPD patient in Bay 6 who kept pulling off his oxygen mask, a post-surgical case in Bay 11 who'd spiked a fever nobody could explain, and a 40-minute argument with the pharmacy over a medication substitution that shouldn't have required an argument at all. Standard night. She'd had thousands of them. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair she kept pulled back so tight it gave her headaches by hour 9, and a face that people consistently described as young for her age, which she'd learned to accept as a compliment even when it wasn't meant as one. She wore her scrubs the same way she'd worn her uniform years ago, sleeves down, nothing loose, nothing that could catch on something at the wrong moment. Old habits. She didn't think about them anymore. They were just part of how she moved through the world. Harwick Memorial was a level 2 trauma center in a mid-sized city that thought of itself as larger than it was. It had 340 beds, a decent trauma bay, a cardiac unit that had won regional awards twice in the past decade, and an ICU on the 4th floor that ran at somewhere between 70 and 90% capacity most nights. It was not the kind of place where things like what was about to happen were supposed to happen. Emily had taken the overnight ICU float position 6 months ago when her transfer from Mercy East came through. She'd wanted the nights. She worked better in the quiet. She thought more clearly when the administrative layer of the hospital was home asleep and the work was just the work. The patients, the monitors, the decisions that had to be made with whatever you had in front of you. She'd been doing exactly that, standing at the station reviewing labs on the post-cardiac patient in Bay 9, when she noticed the man. He came off the elevator at 2:43 a.m. She clocked him the way she clocked everyone who came through a restricted floor at that hour. White coat, stethoscope, lanyard with a badge she couldn't read from 30 feet. He moved toward the nursing station with the practiced ease of someone who belonged, and that was the first thing that snagged in her mind without her quite being able to name why. People who actually belong somewhere don't move like they're demonstrating that they belong somewhere. She watched him sign the visitor log, or appear to sign it, which was different, and exchange a few words with Donna Marsh, the charge nurse, who nodded and gestured vaguely toward the far corridor. Donna was good at her job. She'd been doing it for 19 years and she wasn't careless. But it was 2:43 a.m., and Donna had already handled 2 rapid responses and a combative patient that night, and the man's manner was professional, and his coat was pressed, and sometimes that's enough. Emily stepped closer, kept her movement casual. She was restocking a crash cart near the station, a task she'd been doing anyway, and she let herself drift near enough to see his badge. Dr. M. Calloway, Harwick Memorial, Internal Medicine. She knew the internal medicine attendings. She'd worked with most of them over 6 months of nights. The name Calloway didn't register. But what registered more was the way his left hand hung at his side, slightly forward of his hip, fingers loose, thumb angled out. It was a carry position. Not a weapon on him right now, maybe, but the posture of someone accustomed to having one. She recognized it because she'd spent 4 years cultivating the same posture herself. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. He looked at her. His eyes were pale and utterly calm. "Dr. Calloway, internal medicine consult on the patient in room 14. We haven't gotten a consult order on 14, Emily said. I can pull it up if you want to wait. Donna already verified, he said, and gave her a brief, polished smile. Long night for everyone. He moved past her toward the corridor before she could say anything else. Emily turned to Donna. Did you get a consult order for 14? Donna didn't look up. He's cleared. Let it go. Donna, Emily. The charge nurse finally looked at her, and her expression was not unkind, but it was definite. I've got a family in the waiting room, I've got a patient in 7 whose potassium is tanking, and I've got 6 hours left in this shift. If Dr. Calloway says he has a consult, he has a consult. Go chart. Emily stood there for 3 full seconds. The man had already turned the corner toward room 14. Room 14 was not on the standard rotation. It had been designated a restricted access room 4 days ago when the patient, listed only as John Doe trauma in the system, which was hospital protocol for protected individuals, had been brought in by ambulance with a federal marshal escort and 2 men in plain clothes who hadn't introduced themselves to anyone. The patient had gunshot wounds to the chest and left thigh. He'd been through surgery twice. He was alive, which the surgical attending had said, with the particular exhausted relief of someone who hadn't expected that outcome. He was also unconscious, sedated, and on a ventilator, and he had a deputy federal marshal posted outside his room every shift. Except right now, at 2:46 in the morning, the chair outside room 14 was empty. Emily registered that when she turned the corner. The chair was there. The marshal was not. There was a half-full coffee cup on the floor beside the chair. She almost stopped moving entirely. She didn't stop. She kept walking, measured, quiet, reaching the door to 14 and pressing it open just wide enough to look through. The man in the white coat was standing at the bedside. He had the syringe uncapped and positioned. His attention was entirely on the patient, the IV line, the port, the angle of insertion. "Hey," Emily said. He turned, and she saw in the half-second before everything changed that his expression shifted from clinical focus to something colder and more calculating. He wasn't startled. He was reassessing. "You need to leave," he said. "Where's the marshal?" "I don't know what you're—" "Where is the marshal who was posted outside this room?" He didn't answer that. He set the syringe down on the bedside table with deliberate care and turned to face her fully, and Emily's body made a decision about 3 steps ahead of her conscious mind. She moved left, toward the crash cart in the corner. He moved right, toward his coat pocket. What came out of his pocket was not what she'd expected, not a handgun but a second syringe, larger, unlabeled. He crossed the space between them fast, faster than someone in a white coat had any right to move, and she got her forearm up and took the grab on her wrist instead of her neck, and used his momentum to drive him into the IV pole beside the bed. Metal clanged. The IV pole went sideways, the patient's monitor alarmed. Emily grabbed the crash cart and shoved it between them. "Call security!" she yelled toward the door. Toward anyone in the corridor, anyone at all. "Room 14, call security now!" The man in the white coat yanked his coat off. Underneath, he wore a tactical harness. From it, he drew a compact suppressed handgun, and Emily processed that information with the section of her brain that had been trained to process it quickly and without panic. She got behind the crash cart. She got low. She pulled the defibrillator, a Zoll with enough weight and bulk to be useful, off the top of the cart and held it by its handle. He came around the left side. She went right. The first shot was suppressed, a flat crack that was still loud enough to make her ears ring in the small room, and it punched through the cart drawer above her head. Medical supplies scattered. She heard the door bang open. Someone had heard the alarm. And then a second sound she recognized instantly, a sound that locked everything in her chest for a moment. A body hitting the floor. She came up from behind the cart long enough to see the federal marshal, young, maybe 25, dressed in a gray suit that was now dark with blood, crumpled in the doorway. He'd come back. He'd heard the alarm and come back and walked through a door into a bullet he hadn't had time to react to. The assassin turned back toward the bed, toward the patient, toward the syringe still sitting on the bedside table. Emily threw the defibrillator. She didn't throw it at him. She threw it at the table. The bedside table went over. The syringe hit the floor, rolled under the bed. He flinched. Involuntary, the noise in motion. And in that flinch, she covered the distance between them and got both hands on his gun arm. She knew how to do this. She had been taught by people who were serious about it, in conditions that were serious, and her hands remembered the geometry of it, even if the rest of her was functioning on adrenaline and the particular clarity that only comes when the situation has removed every option except the one directly in front of you. She drove his elbow against the wall. Once. Twice. He didn't drop the weapon, but his grip loosened and she stomped his instep and got her shoulder into his chest, and that put them both into the window blinds with enough force to bring the whole assembly down. He pistol whipped her across the temple. White flash. She hit the floor and the room went sideways for a second that felt much longer. She tasted blood. Bitten cheek, she cataloged automatically, not serious, and pushed herself up on one arm. He stood over her, breathing hard, the gun pointed at her face. "I don't have to make this complicated," he said. He was calm again. That was the thing about him. He defaulted to calm. "Walk out of this room, right now. You don't know what you've gotten into." Her ears were ringing from the shot. She could hear distantly the sound of the hospital alarm system. Overhead, PA, code silver, which was the designation for a weapon on premises. Someone had triggered it, the marshal maybe, before he went down, or a nurse who'd heard the crash. "That man on that bed," Emily said. Her voice was level. She was aware that it was level and she was glad for it. "You're not leaving this room with what you came here to do finished." "You're a nurse," he said, with the particular inflection of someone who thinks the category explains everything. "Yeah," she said. "I know." She'd been sitting on the floor, weight back on her left hand. Her right hand had found, by feel, the edge of the crash cart where it had partially collapsed against the wall beside her. Top drawer, partially open from the impact. Inside a crash cart's top drawer, standard Harwick Memorial configuration. Airway kit, medication tray, and a pair of trauma shears with handles long enough and blades heavy enough to do real damage if used correctly. She closed her hand around the shears. He saw the movement a half second too late, and she swept his lead foot out from under him with her left leg and came up under his gun arm as he went off balance, driving the shears handle into his inner wrist with everything she had. The gun clattered to the floor. She kicked it under the bed, not toward her, away from both of them, because she wasn't trying to arm herself, she was trying to deny him, and put the crash cart between them again and grabbed the wall phone above the headboard. "This is Emily Parker, ICU, room 14. I need security and medical response now. Officer down in the doorway, active weapon in the room. I need backup now." The man looked at her from across the patient's bed. He was bleeding from his wrist where she'd hit him. His gun was under the bed. The syringe was somewhere on the floor. The marshal was in the doorway, and in the corridor she could hear running footsteps. Hospital security, she hoped, coming fast. He looked at the patient. He looked at the door. He looked at Emily. For one moment she thought he was going to try to retrieve the weapon. Instead, he picked up the IV line connected to the patient's arm, and she understood instantly what he was trying to do. Disconnect it, introduce air, cause an embolism with whatever was in that line. And she came over the bed. Not around it. Over it. She got the IV line out of his hand. She got between him and the patient. And she stood there, bleeding from her temple, scrubs half destroyed, crash cart overturned, dying federal marshal in the doorway, and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Security hit the door, 2 of them, with a third behind, and the man in the white coat went for the window. Harwick Memorial's 4th floor ICU had windows that opened 8 inches for ventilation. That was it. He hit the glass anyway, bounced off, and turned to find 3 security officers and a very tired, very battered night nurse blocking every exit from a room that had, in the span of 9 minutes, become something none of them had a training module for. "On the ground," the lead security officer said. His voice was shaking. "Now!" The man looked at all of them. Then he put his hands up, slowly, precisely, the way someone does when they're not surrendering so much as calculating the next move. Emily crossed to the marshal in the doorway and got down beside him. He was breathing. The wound was upper chest, right side, bad, but not instantly fatal if she moved right now. She grabbed a trauma pad from the scattered supplies on the floor and pressed it in and said, "Hey, look at me, stay with me. What's your name?" "Reeves," he gasped. "Okay, Reeves. You're going to be fine. Keep your eyes open." She did not entirely believe the first sentence. She believed the second one completely. The overhead PA was still running the code silver announcement in its calm, recorded voice. In the corridor, she could hear more footsteps, heavier ones now, the kind that came with gear. She could hear radios. She could hear someone giving rapid instructions in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Federal agents. The thought surfaced with a complicated texture. Federal agents were arriving, which meant the protective detail for the man in room 14 had been triggered, which meant backup was here. She held pressure on Reeves's wound and looked back at the man with his hands up and the 4 people holding him against the far wall, and she thought, good, it's over. She was wrong. But she didn't know that yet. Not for another 11 minutes. Not until the agents came through the door and the senior man among them looked at the patient in the bed and then looked at Emily, and she saw something in his expression that was not relief. It was calculation. The same expression the man in the white coat had worn when he first turned around and found her standing in the doorway. Emily kept her hands pressed against Reeves's wound and didn't let her face show anything. But something cold settled in her chest, slow and certain, the way it always settled when she was somewhere dangerous and beginning to understand exactly how dangerous. The senior agent's name was Galloway. He had a badge and a gray suit and the manner of a man who'd been in federal law enforcement for 2 decades and had learned to perform authority so well it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He looked at the man in the white coat, now flex-cuffed against the wall by hospital security, and said, "We'll take him." Then he looked at the patient. Then he looked at Emily. "You should go," he said. "You've done enough." She looked at his eyes. She kept her hands on Reeves and said, "I'm not leaving my patient." Galloway held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he smiled, polished, professional, the kind of smile that didn't reach anything behind it, and said, Of course you're not." He turned to his team and spoke quietly, and 2 of them moved to take up positions inside room 14, and 1 of them moved to close the door. And Emily watched all of it with her hands pressed flat against a wound and her brain running fast and cold through everything she'd just seen. The man in the white coat had come here to kill one specific patient. He'd been neutralized. But the federal agent, now standing between her and the door, had looked at that patient the same way the assassin had. And somewhere in the building, there were more of them. Galloway left the room for 4 minutes. Emily counted. She counted because counting was something to do while she maintained pressure on Reeves's chest wound and watched the 2 agents who remained, one at the door, one near the window. With the peripheral attention she'd learned to keep running like a background process in situations where the obvious threat had been handled and the real one hadn't yet declared itself. 4 minutes and 14 seconds, and then he came back. He had 2 more agents with him, and a man she didn't recognize who wasn't in federal gear. This third man wore a dark jacket and carried a medical bag, actual medical, the right kind, the kind that had a red cross on the side. And he crouched beside Reeves without acknowledging Emily's presence and said, "I've got him." "I'm the nurse on this floor," Emily said. "I'm a paramedic attached to the detail," the man said. He still didn't look at her. "We've got him." She didn't move her hands. "Ma'am?" The agent by the door had stepped forward. Not aggressive, not yet, just closing the distance. "We need to ask you to step back." "I'll step back when I can see his pressure is stable." "Ma'am?" "His systolic was dropping 2 minutes ago. I need to see a reading before I—" "Emily." It was Galloway. He said her name the way someone says a name when they've just learned it from a badge and want you to know that they know it. Controlled. Deliberate. She looked up at him, and he was standing at the foot of the bed near the patient. Near the actual patient she'd come into this room to protect in the first place. And his arms were crossed, and his expression was patient in a way that felt like a threat wearing a suit. "You've been through something tonight," he said. "That's not nothing. What you did, stopping this man, that took real courage. We're going to need your full statement, and we're going to need it soon." He paused. "But right now, this room is an active federal crime scene, and you need to be outside it." She looked at him. She looked at the patient behind him, the man in the bed, the one she'd been positioned between and an assassin 40 minutes ago. And the patient's monitors were reading normal, his ventilator was cycling correctly, and there was nothing visibly wrong with him except that he was unconscious and surrounded by people she no longer trusted. She looked at Reeves, who had a trained paramedic on him now, and whose color was marginally better than it had been. She stood up. "I'll be at the nursing station," she said. Galloway nodded once, that same polished, empty nod. She walked out of the room. She didn't look back. In the corridor, she passed two more agents she hadn't seen before. Positioned, she noticed, not toward the elevator and the stairwell exits, the way standard protective detail should be positioned, but facing inward, facing the room, facing the patient. She got to the nursing station and found Donna standing there with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who had been a charge nurse for 19 years and had never had a code silver before tonight and was handling it by going very, very still. "Are you bleeding?" Donna said. Emily touched her temple. Her fingers came away with dried blood. The pistol whip had opened a cut, probably needed a stitch, possibly two. "It's not deep. You need to go to the ED. I need 5 minutes first." She sat down at the station terminal and pulled up the patient log for room 14. She had access as the floor nurse. That hadn't changed yet, and she moved quickly because she didn't know how long that would remain true. The patient's chart was sparse. It always had been. Protected identity. But there were entries from the past 4 days of care, and she skimmed them with the speed of someone who'd been reading charts for 6 years, looking for anything she'd missed in the routine of managing a stable but critical post-surgical case. The surgical notes were from Dr. Anise Tanner, the trauma attending who'd been on the night he came in. 2 gunshot wounds. One through the lateral chest wall, one through the left thigh. Both surgeries completed without complications. The chest wound had nicked the lower lobe of the right lung. There had been a chest tube subsequently removed. The patient was on a ventilator as a precautionary measure given his lung involvement, not because he couldn't breathe independently. He could be extubated, potentially, if his O2 levels held. She sat with that for a moment. If he could be extubated, he could potentially regain consciousness. He could talk. She didn't know why that felt important. She only knew that it did, with the same certainty that had made her follow a fake doctor into a restricted room at 2:43 in the morning. She pulled up the medication administration record and ran through the last 6 hours of entries. Standard ICU maintenance, sedation protocol. Nothing unusual. Then she went back 12 hours. There was an entry at 6:14 p.m. Nursing note, different nurse, the evening shift. Noting an apparent medication error corrected, attending notified. She clicked through to the incident log. It had been flagged internally. A medication had been charted for administration that hadn't been ordered. The evening nurse had caught it before it was given, flagged it, and moved on. The medication was a sedative, a high-dose benzodiazepine, enough to push someone already on a ventilator into deeper unconsciousness. Someone had tried to keep him under. 12 hours ago. Before tonight. Before the man in the white coat. Emily sat back in her chair. "Donna," she said. Donna was filling out a code silver incident form with the mechanical focus of someone who needed something to do with her hands. "What?" "The patient in 14, the evening medication error at 6 o'clock. Did you hear about that?" Briefly, Keisha caught it. It was logged. "Do you know who entered the order?" Donna stopped writing. She looked at Emily with the measured expression of a woman who was beginning to understand that the night was not over. "It came through the physician order entry system, attributed to the attending." "And the attending?" "Said she didn't enter it." Emily nodded slowly. "Emily," Donna's voice had dropped. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that man in that room has been a target for longer than tonight." She was already reaching for her phone. She had a number she hadn't called in 3 years. A personal number, not a work line. The kind of number that gets exchanged between people who've been in the same places doing the same things and know that someday one of them might need to reach the other without going through any official channel. Her thumb hovered over the contact. The name in her phone was simply Vasquez, R. Staff Sergeant Renata Vasquez, formerly of the 68th Medical Brigade, now, as of last Emily had heard, working somewhere in the architecture of military law enforcement that didn't advertise itself. They hadn't spoken since Emily's discharge. 3 years of silence, which was its own kind of communication between people who understood that some connections go quiet without going dead. She pressed call. It rang twice. "Parker?" Not a question. "Vasquez." A pause. Not long. It's 3 a.m. I know. Another pause. When Vasquez spoke again, the easy cadence was gone, replaced by something flat and precise. Where are you? Harwick Memorial, 4th floor ICU. Emily kept her voice low. The agents in the corridor were 20 feet away. I need you to hear me out, and I need you to not ask how I know what I'm about to tell you, because most of it is instinct, and none of it is provable right now. Okay? There's a protected federal witness in a room on my floor. There was an assassination attempt tonight. It failed. The federal detail that responded... She stopped, chose her words. Something is wrong with it. Wrong how? The senior agent, Galloway, the way he looked at the patient, the way the team is positioned. And there was a medication entry attempt yesterday evening through the system. Sedative, high dose, unauthorized, caught before it was administered. She pressed her thumb and forefinger together. It's a pattern. This wasn't one attempt. Tonight was the backup plan. Silence. Then Vasquez said, What's the witness in connection with? I don't know. The chart's protected. He came in with a marshal escort and no name. Height, approximate age, distinguishing features? Emily thought back to the brief, fractured moments she'd spent in room 14 before everything went sideways. White male, maybe mid-40s, muscular build, even post-surgery, the kind you get from years of something structured. There's a tattoo on his right forearm. I didn't get a good look at it, but it looked like it might be military. Vasquez was quiet for 2 seconds. Parker, do not let anyone alter anything in that room. Do not let them move him. I've been removed from the room. Then get back in. They've got federal authority. Emily. Vasquez almost never used her first name. The sound of it now was deliberate. Listen to me. If that man is who I think he might be, this goes well above a hospital floor. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Emily understood. How long? Give me 20 minutes. The line went dead. Emily set the phone down. Donna was staring at her. Pretend you didn't hear that, Emily said. Donna picked up her incident form and went back to writing. Hear what? Emily stood up, walked to the medication room, and ran cold water over her hands for 30 seconds because they'd started shaking and she needed them to stop. She splashed water on her face. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the sink. The cut at her temple was crusted over. Her scrubs were torn at the left shoulder from when she'd hit the window frame, and she had the look of someone who'd been in a small room with someone who'd tried to kill her. She had been here before, not in a hospital, but in the essential geography of the situation. Alone, outgunned, with something important to protect, and not enough time to do it correctly. She dried her hands and went back out. The change was subtle. She almost missed it. The 2 agents who'd been visible in the corridor near room 14 were no longer there. The door to 14 was closed. The nursing station was empty. Donna had moved somewhere down the hall, maybe the medication room, maybe intentionally giving her space. Emily walked toward 14, not fast, not slow, the way she walked a corridor when she was doing her job. She got within 15 feet when the door opened and Galloway came out. He looked at her and something shifted behind his eyes. The calculation again, working fast. Miss Parker, I thought I asked you to... I need to check my patient's vitals, routine assessment. I'm still the nurse of record on this floor. The paramedic is not a licensed RN and does not have prescriptive authority on this floor. She kept her voice level and professional. I need to do my assessment. That's not optional. He studied her for a moment. The hospital PA was quieter now. The code silver announcement had stopped maybe 10 minutes ago, replaced by a general security advisory that kept the civilian staff back. She could hear, distantly, the sound of voices in the stairwell. More people arriving. 2 minutes, Galloway said. He stepped aside. She went in. The room had changed. Subtly, but it had. The crash cart she'd overturned had been stood back up and moved to the far wall. The IV pole was replaced. The scattered supplies had been gathered. Someone had cleaned efficiently and fast, the way people clean when they're removing evidence rather than maintaining a room. The detail paramedic was no longer there. The patient was alone. Emily went to the bedside and ran through her assessment, vitals, vent settings, IV lines, and everything appeared normal. The monitors were reading correctly. The patient's O2 sat was 97%. His heart rate was 68, perfectly stable. Too stable in a way. Like someone had adjusted the sedation recently. Upward. She checked the IV pump. The sedation rate had been increased. Not dramatically, but enough. At the previous rate, there was a reasonable chance the patient could have begun trending toward consciousness over the next several hours. At the new rate, that window had been extended by at least 6 or 8 hours. Someone wanted him unconscious. Someone with access to this room and familiarity with ICU equipment had adjusted his sedation in the 20-plus minutes since Galloway's team had arrived. She stood at the bedside and looked at the man in the bed. He was large. She noticed again what she'd noticed during the chaos earlier, the particular density of someone who'd spent years in physical work. On his right forearm, the tattoo was visible now that the chaos had cleared. A trident, stylized, overlaid with a set of wings. She didn't know exactly what unit that corresponded to, but she knew the tradition it came from. Military, special operations, the kind of unit that ran the missions that didn't appear in any report. She took out her phone, photographed the tattoo. Fast, steady, the phone angled to catch the detail. She didn't know if she'd need it. She took it anyway. Time's up. Galloway at the door. She pocketed her phone and walked out. In the corridor, she passed close enough to Galloway that she could see the line of his jacket over his left hip. There was a sidearm there, standard issue. But there was also something else. A phone clipped to his belt, screen lit, a text notification visible for just a moment before he registered her proximity and shifted. She didn't read the full message. She read 4 words. Still breathing. She kept walking. She got back to the station, sat down, and looked at the clock. It had been 9 minutes since she'd called Vasquez. She had 11 left. The problem was she didn't think she had 11 minutes. She was trying to work out what to do with that, trying to think through the actual options, the real ones, not the theoretical ones, when the elevator opened and 6 people came out. Not in federal gear, not in hospital scrubs. 3 of them wore tactical clothing with no visible insignia. The other 3 wore suits, the kind of tailored, serious suits that came with credentials that superseded anything Galloway had on his belt. Leading them was a woman Emily had never seen before. She was maybe 50, with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd given difficult orders and lived with the results of them. She wore a charcoal jacket and dark trousers and a lanyard with a badge Emily couldn't read from across the floor. But the 3 tactical personnel flanking her moved with the practiced geometry of people who took orders from exactly one person. The woman scanned the floor. Her eyes moved in a pattern Emily recognized. Exits first, threats second, assets third. Then those eyes landed on Emily at the nursing station. She walked over. The 2 people flanking her kept pace but stayed a step back. "You're Parker," the woman said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes." Sergeant First Class Emily Parker, formerly 68th Medical Brigade, 2 tours, honorable discharge 3 years ago. Emily felt the back of her neck prickle. "I'm Emily Parker, RN. Who are you?" Deputy Director Marlene Okafor, Defense Intelligence Agency. She said it the way people say things that have stopped surprising them. "Vasquez called me. She said you'd spotted something." Emily looked past her at the corridor toward room 14. "Galloway." Okafor's jaw tightened. "We know." His team adjusted the patient's sedation. Within the last 20 minutes, they're keeping him under. Okafor turned to the nearest of the tactical personnel and said 3 words. "Secure the room." And they moved, and Emily watched the controlled efficiency of people who were very good at a specific set of tasks executing those tasks. And then she turned back to Okafor. "The patient in room 14, Emily said. "Tell me who he is." Okafor looked at her for a moment, the look of someone weighing what to give and what to keep. "His name is Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb," Okafor said. "He was embedded in a defense procurement network for 22 months. 3 weeks ago, he extracted himself with enough evidence to prosecute 11 people, including 3 senior officials in the contracting chain and 2 people in federal law enforcement." Emily held Okafor's gaze. Galloway is on the list. Has been for 4 months. We've been building the case." A pause. Webb's testimony is the center of it. Without him conscious and able to speak, the physical evidence is circumstantial. So Galloway's been trying to keep him sedated, or dead, whichever came first. Tonight was the third attempt. The medication entry yesterday was the second. Okafor's expression was not warm, but it was direct. And Emily respected that more than warmth in this particular moment. The first was a vehicle incident before he reached the hospital. His injury tonight was not entirely from enemy contact. Emily absorbed that. He was shot by someone on his own detail, she said. Okafor didn't confirm it verbally. She didn't have to. Down the corridor, Emily heard raised voices. Galloway, she thought, in the particular pitch of someone who had just walked into a situation they hadn't anticipated and was trying to reassert authority. Then a shorter, harder sound. Then silence. One of Okafor's tactical personnel appeared at the end of the corridor. He gave a hand signal Emily didn't know the specific designation for, but understood the general meaning of secured. Galloway? Emily asked. In custody, Okafor said. His team has been detained. We're holding them for federal processing. She paused again. You need medical attention. I need to know the patient is safe. Okafor almost smiled. Not quite. He will be. Now that we have the floor secured and Galloway's people are out of that room, we can begin bringing the sedation down safely. She looked at Emily with an expression that had shifted from assessment to something more direct. That's going to need a nurse. Emily stood up from the station chair. Give me 2 minutes to get a fresh set of gloves, she said. She was at the medication room door when she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a change in the ambient sound of the building. The elevator opened. Not the main elevator, the service elevator at the far end of the floor. The one that required a key card she'd used exactly twice in 6 months. 2 men came out of it. They were not in tactical gear, they were not federal agents. They wore hospital maintenance uniforms, the right shade of gray, the right logo on the chest pocket, and one of them carried a tool bag that was the wrong weight for what maintenance personnel typically carried at 4 in the morning. Emily had a direct line of sight from the medication room door. Okafor and her personnel were at the far end of the corridor outside room 14, focused on the transition happening inside the room, their backs angled away. The 2 men in maintenance uniforms moved fast and quiet toward the nursing station, cutting diagonally toward the corridor that led to the patient's room. Emily did the calculation in about 2 seconds. She was closer. The tactical personnel were 30 feet further away, wrong angle, wrong focus. If she yelled, the men would hear her before Okafor's team could respond. She didn't yell. She stepped out of the medication room doorway, put herself in the path of the closer of the 2 men, and held up her badge in a gesture that looked exactly like a challenged nurse trying to stop unauthorized personnel from entering a restricted area, which was precisely what it was. This floor is restricted. I need to see your work order. The man stopped. He was broad, maybe 6 feet, with the kind of neck that came from years of something other than swinging a wrench. He looked at her badge, then at her face, and his expression told her in the space of a fraction of a second that he recognized her. Not personally, but categorically, as the problem. Routine electrical check, he said. At 4 in the morning, the ICU is not on the schedule for routine electrical. She kept her voice absolutely even. I need your work order and your supervisor's name. Lady, we've got the authorization from who? The second man had moved slightly to her right while the first was talking. She tracked him in her peripheral vision. Tool bag in his right hand, which meant his right hand was occupied, and if he reached inside that bag, he'd have to set it down or transfer it. A half-second action, noisy, visible. She pulled out her phone with her left hand and said, I'm calling the facility's supervisor to confirm. She wasn't calling the facility's supervisor. She was calling back the number she'd just had open 6 minutes ago. The first man reached for her phone arm and she dropped it, literally dropped the phone so that it clattered to the floor between them. And in the moment, his eyes went to the phone, she stepped back and shouted clear and hard, Okafor! Service corridor! Now! The second man went for the bag. The first man grabbed her arm, and she let him, because she needed 2 seconds, and she got them before Okafor's tactical personnel came around the corner at a dead run, and the second man got the bag open to reveal what was inside it, and then made the very fast decision to put his hands up instead. The first man held on to Emily's arm for exactly 1 second after that. Then a tactical officer had him against the wall, and Emily was stepping back and breathing through her nose slowly because her heart was doing something unpleasant and she needed it to slow down. Okafor stood at the corner of the corridor, taking in the two men, the bag, the tool uniforms, and Emily in that precise scanning way she had. "Third team," she said. It wasn't a question. Emily bent down and picked up her phone. The screen was cracked. It still worked. "He doesn't have just one backup plan," Emily said. "He has several." Okafor looked at her steadily. "No," she said, "he doesn't." She pulled out her own phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds and consisted mostly of her relaying coordinates, numbers, and instructions in a tone that made it clear she expected instant compliance and was accustomed to receiving it. When she hung up, she looked at Emily with an expression that had moved past assessment into something else. "In 20 minutes, Okafor said, "this building is going to have a significant federal presence. Building perimeter, exits, elevator banks, everything. We've been waiting on authorization to move at this scale and—" She paused, something working in her expression, "and your call to Vasquez pushed the timeline forward." Another pause. "Which turns out to have been the correct timeline." Emily nodded. "Are there other people in this hospital?" Okafor said, "who could be targets? Other patients or personnel that Galloway's network might—" "I don't know," Emily said honestly. "But I know this floor and I know who's been through it tonight, and I can tell you everything I've seen." "Then do that." Okafor gestured toward the nursing station. "Walk me through it." They sat down together, the deputy director of a federal intelligence agency and a night shift ICU nurse with a cracked phone and a 2-stitch cut on her temple. And Emily talked, and Okafor listened the way someone listens when every word matters and they know it. And at some point, Donna appeared with 2 cups of coffee from the break room and set them down without a word and went back to her corner of the station because Donna had been a nurse for 19 years, and she knew when to stay out of something and when to just make the coffee. 22 minutes later, the building perimeter teams arrived. 31 minutes after that, the sedation in room 14 had been reduced to the minimal maintenance level that Emily calculated would allow the patient to begin trending toward consciousness within the next 4 to 6 hours. She was standing at the bedside, checking the adjusted drip rate, when she noticed the patient's right hand move. Just slightly. A reflexive curl of the fingers, the kind of unconscious motor response that happened when someone was beginning, however slowly, to surface. She stood there and watched it happen and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for hours and could feel it beginning to metabolize. Behind her, outside in the corridor, she could hear federal personnel moving through the floor in a systematic sweep. She could hear radios. She could hear, distantly, the sound of Galloway's voice, still precise, still authoritative, still performing, as he was walked to the elevator by 2 people whose authority was several tiers above his. She adjusted the IV rate one final time and checked the monitor and began writing her nursing note. The factual, precise, timed nursing note that would become part of the record of this night. She was 3 sentences in when she heard it. Not in the room. Down the hall. A single sharp sound, metal against metal, the kind that happened when something was dropped or thrown in the stairwell. Then shouting, one of the federal tactical personnel, she thought. And then running, heavy and fast, heading toward the ICU. She was already turning when the door to room 14 burst open. The man who came through the door wasn't one of Okafor's people. He was wearing the right gear, tactical vest, no insignia, the kind of flat-soled boots that federal personnel favored. But he moved wrong. Too fast, no radio check, no verbal clearance with anyone behind him. He had a weapon drawn, and his eyes went immediately to the bed, not to Emily, not to the room, to the bed, and that single-point focus told her everything she needed to know about why he was here. She was between him and the patient before she'd made a conscious decision to move there. "Stop," she said. He looked at her. He was young, mid-30s maybe, with the close-cropped hair and controlled expression of someone with military background, which meant she couldn't read him the easy way. His weapon was a compact Glock, held at a low ready that was very close to a high ready. "Step aside," he said. "No. I'm federal law enforcement. Show me your credentials." She kept her hands visible, her voice flat. Right now. Badge and credentials slow. He didn't show her anything. His eyes moved to the patient again, then back to her face, calculating. Behind him, in the corridor, she could hear movement. Okafor's tactical personnel, she thought, responding to whatever had happened in the stairwell. The sound was maybe 15 seconds away. 15 seconds was not a short amount of time when someone had a gun pointed in your direction. "Lady," he said. "Last chance." "You've got federal agents about 12 seconds from this door," Emily said. "If you're legitimate, you want them here. If you're not, you're already out of options either way." She held his gaze without blinking. "So put it down." He didn't put it down, but he didn't raise it either. The door hit the wall behind him as two of Okafor's tactical personnel came through, real ones, the ones she'd watched work for the past hour, and took him down in the efficient, practiced way of people who'd done this enough that it wasn't exciting anymore. One knee on the floor, weapon secured, hands behind his back in about 4 seconds. Emily leaned against the wall beside the patient's bed and let herself shake for about 5 seconds, which was all she could afford. Then she straightened up. The tactical officer nearest her, a woman, dark hair, a scar along her jaw that she'd had for long enough it had gone pale, looked at Emily with something between professional assessment and plain surprise. "You're still here," the officer said. "It's my floor," Emily said. Okafor appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. She took in the downed man, the room, Emily at the bedside, all of it in that same scanning sweep she did everything in. "Galloway's fourth man," she said to no one in particular. "We had 3 in custody, couldn't account for the 4th. He came in through the stairwell service access." She looked at Emily. "You're not hurt?" "No." "Good." A beat. "We're locking down the floor fully now. No movement in or out except my personnel." She stepped further into the room and looked at the patient. At the monitor readings, the IV lines, the slow cycling of the ventilator. "How long until he can talk?" Emily checked the time. Checked the sedation rate she'd set 20 minutes ago. 4 hours, maybe 5. It depends how his body responds coming off the sedation. And when he does start surfacing, he's going to need time. He's been under for days. He'll be confused. He might not be coherent for another hour after he opens his eyes. Okafor nodded. A precise, accepting nod. Not happy about the timeline, but not fighting it either. "Then we have 4 hours to make sure nobody else gets through," she said. She turned and went back into the corridor, and Emily could hear her reorganizing the personnel positions, tightening the perimeter on the ICU entrance, calling for additional coverage on the service stairwell and the elevator banks. The voice of someone who'd been managing crisis situations for long enough that the management itself was rote. The assessment underneath it, the reading of what each decision cost and what it bought, that was where the real work was happening, quiet and continuous. Emily sat down in the chair beside the patient's bed. She hadn't sat down since before midnight. It was now 4:22 in the morning. Her temple had stopped bleeding, but it had tightened into a dull, persistent ache that she suspected was going to become a genuine headache once the adrenaline finally cleared completely. Her left shoulder was sore from the impact with the window frame. Her hands, when she looked at them, had 2 broken nails and a bruise developing across the back of her right hand that she didn't remember earning. She looked at the man in the bed. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, a name and a rank attached to a face she'd been protecting without knowing either. His right hand was still. The small movement she'd seen earlier, the reflexive curl of the fingers, hadn't repeated. But his color was better than it had been 2 days ago when she'd come on shift and seen him for the first time as a critical but stable post-surgical case. The chest tube site was clean. His lung sounds, on her last assessment, were clear on the right and marginally reduced on the left, which was consistent with post-surgical recovery and not concerning. His heart rate had settled from the elevated range it'd been sitting in for the past hour. The body, she'd noticed many times, registered threat even when the mind was chemically suppressed. It was settling now, as the floor settled. She wrote her nursing note. She wrote it carefully and completely, with times and observations and assessments, because whatever else happened tonight, the record of it needed to be accurate and it needed to be hers. The note would be in the chart before anyone could alter it. She'd learned that instinct somewhere between her second tour and her first year of nursing. You document what you saw when you saw it, not later, not after someone has told you what you should have seen. She was finishing the note when Okafor came back in. The deputy director sat down in the second chair, the visitor chair against the wall, the one that had held a federal marshal and then nobody, and then people who had no business being there. And for a moment she just looked at the window, which showed nothing but the dark and the distant glow of the city. Galloway has been in the DIA's peripheral vision for 2 years, Okafor said. Not a briefing tone, just talking, which felt deliberate. We knew something was wrong with the Webb operation. We knew there was a leak. We didn't know how high it went until 3 weeks ago, when Webb came out. Emily didn't say anything. She'd learned when to let people continue. Galloway has been routing intelligence to a private defense contractor called Vantage Meridian for at least 4 years. They bid on classified procurement contracts. They win those contracts because they know what the competing bids are going to be. The margin on those contracts, Okafor paused, is in the hundreds of millions. And Webb found that. Webb documented it. He has records, communications, financial transfers. He has names. Okafor looked at her hands. He is also the only person with standing to testify to what he personally witnessed. The documentation is strong, but a good defense attorney. She stopped, started again. Without Webb's testimony, we might get 2 convictions. With it, we get 11. Including Galloway. And 2 of his supervisors in the chain, both of whom are still currently sitting in positions with active security clearance. Okafor's jaw tightened. Which is a situation I intend to correct in approximately 3 hours. Emily looked at the patient, at the slow rise and fall of his chest. He took a bullet before he got to this hospital, she said. You said that earlier, someone on his own detail. One of Galloway's people embedded in the protective rotation. Webb made it to the hospital because the other 2 marshals on the transport kept him alive in the vehicle. One of those marshals didn't survive the transport. Okafor said it without inflection, but the muscles in her neck shifted. His name was Deputy Marshal Leonard Ferris, 28 years old. The room was quiet for a moment. Emily thought about Reeves, the young marshal she'd held pressure on in the doorway, the one who'd come back when he heard the alarm and walked through a door into a bullet. She'd heard from one of the ER nurses half an hour ago that he was in surgery, that the prognosis was cautious but not catastrophic. She was holding on to that. You need to sleep, Okafor said. In a while. You've been on shift for... I know how long I've been on shift. Came out sharper than she intended. She dialed it back. I'll go when I know he's stable and there's somebody with actual medical training in this room. Okafor accepted that. I have a physician on the way up. DIA medical officer. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Then I'll go in 20 minutes. The next 20 minutes were the quietest of the night. The floor had settled into the particular hush of a place that had been through something and was now being held very carefully in place. She could hear the federal personnel in the corridor, measured movement, radio check-ins at intervals, the systematic calm of people doing containment work. Through the door, she could see the corridor was fully lit, which was different from the dim ICU lighting she was used to at this hour. At 4:51 a.m., the DIA physician arrived. A compact, efficient man named Dr. Harlan, who went directly to the bedside, reviewed the chart Emily handed him, asked her 3 specific questions about the sedation adjustment timeline, and then said, "Good call on the rate. This is right." She nodded. She picked up her phone, cracked screen, still functional, and her ID badge, and she walked out of room 14 for the first time in over 2 hours. In the corridor, she stopped. Donna was at the nursing station. The evening charge had long since been replaced by whoever should have been the overnight supervisor, but that person had apparently not made it past the federal perimeter at the hospital entrance, which meant Donna was still there, on hour 11 of what should have been a 10-hour shift, drinking terrible coffee and doing what she always did, which was keep the floor running. "Go," Donna said, without looking up. "The patient's in... I have them. Go get your head looked at." Emily looked down the corridor one more time. Okafor was at the far end, phone at her ear, coordinating something. The 2 tactical officers outside room 14 were in position. The floor felt, for the first time since 2:43 in the morning, like something that was going to hold. She took the elevator down to the ED. The emergency department at 5 a.m. was operating in its strange between-hours state. The late-night rush of trauma and alcohol and accidents had thinned out, but the morning surge hadn't started yet. An ED nurse named Brennan took one look at Emily's temple and guided her to a bay without making her explain anything, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated at that moment. 2 stitches, local anesthetic, a quick neuro check, follow the light, squeeze my hands, what year is it? Which she passed without difficulty, though the question about the year made her want to say something she kept to herself. You want to tell me what happened? Brennan asked, threading the second stitch. Work thing, Emily said. Brennan tied it off. Heck of a work thing. She was handed an ice pack, a cup of water, and a wound care instruction sheet that she could have written from memory. She sat in the bay for 7 minutes. Then she went back upstairs. She wasn't entirely sure why. She told herself it was professional accountability. She was still technically the nurse of record on the floor until relief arrived. She told herself it was the instinct toward completion, toward seeing a thing through to its natural endpoint. Both of those things were true. They were not the whole of it. The whole of it was that she'd been the only person in this building who'd seen it clearly from the beginning, and she needed to know that what she'd done with that, all the ungainly, painful, improvised things she'd done, had been enough. She came back onto the 4th floor at 5:19 a.m. She knew something had changed before she fully registered why. The quality of movement in the corridor was different. Okafor's personnel were still positioned correctly, but 2 of them had shifted angle, facing room 14 rather than the corridor approaches, and the door to the room was slightly open where it had been fully closed. She walked faster. Through the gap in the door, she could see Dr. Harlan at the bedside, leaning in, stethoscope out. She could see the monitor. The numbers had shifted. Heart rate up slightly, respiratory rate up slightly. O2 sat holding at 96. She pushed the door open. Marcus Webb's eyes were open, not fully, half-lidded, heavy, the unfocused look of someone pulling up through layers of sedation and time, but open. His head was turned slightly on the pillow. His right hand had moved. It was resting on his chest now, not at his side. His lips were moving around the ventilator tube, which was instinctive and uncomfortable and meant he was aware enough to register the intrusion of it. Doctor. Harlan looked up when Emily came in. He started surfacing about 4 minutes ago, faster than the timeline you projected. His labs from yesterday showed strong metabolic clearance, Emily said, moving to the bedside. I thought it might be faster. Can he breathe around the tube? Vent check was solid. I think he can come off. Emily looked at Webb's face. His eyes had tracked to her. Slowly, imprecisely, the eyes of someone who was looking without yet fully seeing, but they'd tracked. Okay, she said, let's get the tube out. The extubation took 6 minutes, including the airway assessment, and the 2 minutes she made him wait after the pilot balloon deflation to confirm he was managing his own respiratory effort. He coughed when the tube came out. Long, productive, the body's immediate protest at what it had been tolerating. And she had suction ready, and she used it, and then she held the oxygen mask over his face while he breathed, shallow and rapid at first, and then gradually, over the next 90 seconds, deeper. Mr. Webb, Dr. Harlan said, can you hear me? A pause. Then, rough and barely audible. Yeah. You're in a hospital. You're safe. Take your time. Webb's eyes moved again, slower this time, around the room, the IV lines, the monitors, the ceiling, the door, then back. He was cataloging, she realized, taking inventory of the space the way someone does when they need to know where the exits are. His eyes landed on Emily. She wasn't sure what he saw. A nurse with a bruised face and 2 fresh stitches at her temple, still in torn scrubs at 5-something in the morning. Not much to look at. Not anyone you'd notice in a crowd. You were here, he said. His voice was raw from the tube. Before. In the room. She hadn't thought he'd been aware of anything. He'd been unconscious. She'd assumed he was unconscious. Yes, she said. There was... He stopped. Coughed once, controlled it. Someone else. Not medical. He's in custody, she said. You're safe. He looked at her for another moment. Then his eyes closed, and she thought he'd gone back under, but his voice came again, quieter. How many of them? She understood what he was asking. How many of Galloway's people? How deep it went? How much of the protective detail had been compromised? She looked at Harlan. He gave her a slight nod. She could answer. "We're still counting," she said honestly, "but the senior one is in custody. His access has been cut." Webb's jaw tightened, opened. "Galloway." "Yes." A long exhale. His hand, the right one, the one with the trident tattoo, closed and opened slowly on the blanket. Processing. Or simply feeling something he didn't have a word for at the moment. "Okay," he said. "Just that." "Okay." The economy of a man who'd spent years in situations where excess language was a liability. Okafor appeared in the doorway. She saw Webb's open eyes and stopped, and for just a moment her controlled expression broke. Not into relief, not quite, but into something that had relief's edges. The look of someone who has been preparing for a specific outcome for months and is seeing it become possible. She came to the bedside, crouched slightly to be at his level. "Marcus," she said. Webb looked at her. His eyes were clearer now. The sedation fog burning off unevenly, clarity arriving in patches. He studied her face. "Okafor," he said. Then, "You're late." "I know." "Ferris," he said. One word, a question shaped like a name. Okafor's expression didn't move. "Yes." Webb looked at the ceiling, said nothing for 6 seconds, then, "The documentation. I had it cached. We have it. Secured. We've had it for 18 hours. Okafor's voice was steady. "Your job right now is to keep breathing. The rest of it is handled." He looked back at her, then at Emily, again in that way he had of tracking the room. "Who's she?" "Emily Parker," Okafor said. "She's the reason you're alive to ask that question." Webb looked at Emily. She looked back. She was tired enough that she didn't try to arrange her expression into anything particular. She just stood there, IV tube in one hand, cracked phone in her pocket, stitches pulling slightly at her temple. "Parker," he said. "Webb," she said. He almost did something that might have been the early stages of a smile, arrested by the effort it would have cost. Then his eyes cut to the door, fast and sharp, all the grogginess gone in an instant. Emily heard it too, not the federal personnel in the corridor. Something different, a disruption in the rhythm of it, a gap where there had been regular movement. Then a voice she recognized. Galloway. But Galloway was in custody. Galloway had been walked to the elevator 2 hours ago by 2 of Okafor's people, and she had heard it, had registered it as resolved. The voice was getting closer. Okafor was already moving toward the door. Emily stepped to the bedside. Instinct, the same instinct that had put her between the man in the white coat and this bed 4 hours ago. Webb's hand closed around her wrist. She looked down. His grip was weak, but his eyes were completely clear. "Don't," he said quietly. "Let her handle it." Emily looked at the door. Galloway came through it with his hand still bound in front of him and a federal officer behind him who was struggling to control the situation without drawing a weapon inside a hospital room. Galloway's face was different now. The polished authority was gone, stripped away, replaced by something raw. He looked at Webb in the bed, and something moved across his face that Emily couldn't categorize neatly. It wasn't guilt. It was something more like frustration. The expression of someone who had planned carefully and watched the plan come apart. "Marcus," he said. Webb said nothing. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Galloway said. His voice was tight, controlled, but the control was costing him. "The work we were doing, the security architecture around these contracts, you think the official procurement system—" "That's enough," Okafor said. She was behind him, and her voice had the quality of a door closing. "He needs to hear this. He doesn't." Okafor looked at the federal officer who'd come in with Galloway. "Get him out of this room." Galloway looked at Webb one more time, then at Emily, and this look was different, harder, the look of a man filing something away. "You have no idea what you've done," he said to her. "Get him out," Okafor said. They took him out. The room was quiet again. Webb's grip on Emily's wrist had loosened but hadn't let go. His breathing had remained even through all of it, which told her something about the kind of training he'd had, the body holding to a baseline even when the mind was processing something that had personal weight. After a moment, he released her wrist. "He really believed that?" Emily asked. "That what he was doing was justified?" Okafor from near the door. "Some of them do. It doesn't change what it was." Emily nodded. She adjusted Webb's oxygen mask, checked his pulse ox. 95, acceptable, trending upward. His color was better. He was going to need days of recovery before he was anywhere near fit to testify, but the physical trajectory was right. She was updating the monitor settings when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize, Caldwell area code. She almost didn't answer. She answered, "Is this Emily Parker?" A woman's voice, tense. "Yes." "This is Dr. Anise Tanner. I'm the trauma attending who operated on your patient in room 14. I'm in the parking structure right now, and A pause, something that sounded like a caught breath. "I need to know if it's safe to come in. I've been getting calls since midnight that I don't understand, and an hour ago, someone followed me from my apartment to my car." Emily went still. "Dr. Tanner, are you in your car right now?" "Yes, I drove here because I didn't know what else to do. Someone tried to—" Another pause. "There's a man in a gray sedan parked at the entrance of the structure. He was there when I pulled in. He hasn't moved." Emily looked at Okafor. "Stay in your car," Emily said. "Lock the doors. I'm going to give your number to someone right now, and they're going to get you out of that parking structure safely." She pulled the phone away from her ear. Okafor. Okafor was already crossing the room, hand out for the phone. Emily handed it over and watched Okafor take it and step into the corridor, her voice dropping into the efficient, precise cadence of someone managing a situation that had just added a new variable. Emily stood at the bedside. Webb was watching her. He'd heard enough. "She was the surgeon," he said. "Yes." "They're cleaning up," he said. "Anyone who treated me. Anyone who has any connection to me being here." Emily looked at the door. Okafor in the corridor mobilizing response to the parking structure. The tactical personnel repositioning. "How many people know about your case?" she asked. "More than Galloway wanted," Webb said. He closed his eyes. Then opened them again because closing them clearly wasn't something he was willing to do with loose ends still moving. "Is there anyone else? Anyone on this floor? Anyone on the hospital staff who had contact with me in the last 4 days?" Emily thought about it. Donna. Dr. Tanner was in the parking structure. The evening nurses who'd caught the medication error. The surgical team from 3 days ago. The anesthesiologist. She started making a mental list, and it was longer than she wanted it to be. She picked up the nursing station phone on the bedside table and dialed the charge desk. "Donna," she said when Donna picked up. "I need you to pull the full staff contact list for everyone who's had documented interaction with the patient in room 14 since admission. Every nurse, every physician, every tech. Right now." A pause. "Emily, it's almost 6 in the morning. I know what time it is. Pull the list." Donna pulled the list. Emily was writing down the 12th name when she heard the sound from the corridor. Not a voice this time, not footsteps, but the specific crackle of a radio failing, just for a second. Then silence, where there should have been the steady presence of federal personnel. She looked at the door. The corridor outside was empty. The corridor wasn't empty because something had gone wrong with the personnel. It was empty because the personnel had moved. She could hear them now, further down, toward the service stairwell, responding to something. The radio crackle had been interference, not a cut line. And Okafor was still just outside, visible through the narrow window beside the door, phone at her ear, back turned, managing Dr. Tanner's situation in the parking structure. Emily stood there for 3 full seconds, convincing herself of this. Then she checked the corridor properly, leaned out, looked both directions, and saw that she was right. 2 of the tactical officers had repositioned toward the stairwell. The other 2 were still at the elevator bank. Nothing was wrong. She had spooked herself, which was a reasonable thing to have done given the preceding 4 hours, but it was still spooking. She went back to the bedside. Webb was watching the door. "Clear," she said. He nodded once, the small nod of someone accepting intelligence from a source they've decided to trust. She noted that, the decision quality of it, and said nothing. She finished writing down the staff contact list while Donna read names and positions over the phone. 12 people in total who'd had documented patient contact with room 14 in the past 4 days. She handed the list to Okafor when the deputy director came back through the door, and Okafor looked at it and immediately began assigning personnel to reach each person and confirm their status and location. Dr. Tanner was extracted from the parking structure in 11 minutes. The gray sedan turned out to be a Vantage Meridian contractor, not law enforcement, not federal, a private hire. And he was taken into custody in the parking structure lobby by 2 of Okafor's people without incident, which was the best possible version of that situation. The other names on the list took longer. Emily stayed on the floor through the shift change, which happened at 7, and then through the next 2 hours while federal personnel worked through the building, confirming staff locations and establishing what Okafor described in a phone call Emily overheard as the full perimeter of exposure. Most of the names on the list were unreachable at first. It was early morning, people were asleep, not answering, and each unanswered call generated 20 minutes of elevated tension until the person was located by other means. All 12 were accounted for by 9:14 a.m. None of them had been harmed. Galloway's network had been moving toward that step. Dr. Tanner was the only one who'd been directly followed, but the arrests on the 4th floor and the parking structure had apparently cut the operational chain before the order to act on the wider exposure list had been executed. Apparently. Emily held that word carefully. It was the kind of word that left room for things you hadn't found yet. She was at the nursing station writing her final shift documentation, a task that had been interrupted approximately 7 times in the past 4 hours, when Okafor sat down across from her. "Galloway's people are talking," Okafor said. Emily looked up. Not Galloway himself, but 3 of the 4 agents detained tonight have retained separate counsel, and at least one of them has indicated he'll cooperate with the federal investigation. Okafor set her phone on the desk with the careful deliberateness of someone putting down something heavy. When one person on a team decides the other people on the team are more of a liability than loyalty as an asset, it tends to accelerate. How quickly? Depends on what he gives us. But given what we already have from Webb's documentation, Okafor paused, and something in her expression shifted into something more direct than anything Emily had seen from her tonight. "I think we're talking about federal charges filed within 72 hours. Against Galloway, against 2 of his supervisors, against 6 Vantage Meridian executives, including their CEO. Emily set down her pen. She'd been in the Army. She knew how these things worked, or rather, she knew how they often didn't. Cases that went quiet, evidence that got complicated, people with enough connections to make accountability optional. She'd seen it, not often, but enough to have calibrated her expectations accordingly. "You sound certain," she said. "I'm not," Okafor said. "But I'm more certain than I was yesterday." Mr. A pause. Webb's documentation is extensive. He was thorough, the kind of thorough that comes from spending 22 months knowing that if anything went wrong, the documentation was the only thing keeping him alive. Emily thought about that. 22 months inside a criminal procurement network, watching what was happening, building a record of it, every day knowing what happened to people who got found out. She picked her pen back up and went back to her documentation. "You should sleep," Okafor said. "You've said that." It was true then, too. Emily finished the sentence she was writing. "The charge nurse on the morning shift is Yolanda Kramer. She's good. She knows the floor." She set the pen down. "I'll go when I've handed off properly." Okafor stood up. She looked at Emily for a moment with an expression Emily couldn't fully read, something between respect and the particular look of someone who recognizes a version of themselves in another person and isn't entirely sure how to respond to that. "Parker," she said. Emily looked up. "For what it's worth," Okafor stopped, started again. "What you did tonight, the way you held that room, most people, She stopped again, shook her head slightly as if revising. "It mattered. What you did mattered." Emily held her gaze. "I know," she said. Not arrogance, just the statement of someone who'd been certain of exactly one thing through the entire long night, and that was that it had been worth doing. Okafor almost smiled again. She walked back toward room 14. The handoff to Yolanda Kramer took 20 minutes and involved Emily explaining, in the most clinical terms she could manage, the situation on the floor. Yolanda was 53, had been a nurse for 27 years, had worked through 2 hurricanes and a hospital hostage situation in 2019, and she received Emily's summary with the professional equanimity of someone who'd long ago stopped being surprised by what a hospital night could produce. "I've got it," Yolanda said. "Go home." Emily took the elevator down. She walked through the lobby, which had 3 federal agents stationed at the entrance now, visible and deliberate, and out the main doors and into the Caldwell morning. It was nearly 10 o'clock. The city was fully awake, going about itself, entirely unaware of what the 4th floor of the building behind her had been for the past 7 hours. She sat in her car for a while without starting it. Her hands were on the wheel. Outside, a food truck was setting up across the street. A man walked a dog past the hospital entrance. 2 nurses from the day shift she recognized were coming in, coffee cups in hand, talking about something that made one of them laugh. She drove home. She slept for 6 hours. It was not a clean sleep. She woke up twice, once from a sound that turned out to be her upstairs neighbor's television, once from nothing she could identify, and lay in the dark thinking about the corridor outside room 14 and the way Galloway had looked at the patient and the way Webb's fingers had curled in the first signs of surfacing. Then she went back to sleep. At 4 in the afternoon, her phone rang. It was Vasquez. "How are you?" Vasquez said. "Tired." "You look worse than tired," Vasquez said, which meant she'd seen something. News, a report, an internal document that included Emily's name or photograph or both. 2 stitches. "It's not serious." "I know. I read the medical report." A pause. And Emily could hear the sound of Vasquez's environment. Office, indoors, the specific acoustic of a federal building. "You did good, Parker." "Okafor told me her people are talking. 3 of them, as of this morning. The 4th is still holding, but his lawyer has been making calls, which means he's calculating." Vasquez's voice had the careful, measured quality of someone sharing information that was not classified but was adjacent to things that were. "Galloway is not talking. He won't. He's been in this world too long to think cooperation buys him anything worth having." And the Vantage Meridian executives. 2 of them have already retained criminal defense attorneys, which the DOJ considers an encouraging sign. A brief, dry pause. The CEO issued a statement this morning calling the allegations baseless and politically motivated. He'll be in federal custody by Friday. Emily sat up on her couch. That's fast. Webb's documentation is extensive. Okafor wasn't overstating it. The financial records alone. Vasquez stopped. Reshaped. "Let me put it this way. When the prosecution has the receipts, the timeline compresses significantly." Emily was quiet for a moment. "How is Reeves?" "Out of surgery. Prognosis is good. He'll be on restricted duty for 6 to 8 months, but he's going to be fine." A beat. "He's already asking about you, apparently." "I'll send flowers," Emily said. "He'd probably prefer you to come in person." "I'll think about it." She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the wall and drank it. She was not, she recognized, in a state of relief or triumph or any of the feelings she might have anticipated feeling at the end of something like this. She was in the state she was usually in at the end of a difficult shift. Hollow, slightly raw, the particular flatness that follows a long period of sustained acute focus. The next 3 days were strange. She went back to work the following night, because the floor still needed nurses, and because staying home felt worse than going in. Yolanda had written a handoff note that included the line, "You have a good one here," addressed, Emily gathered, to the shift supervisor rather than to Emily herself, which was somehow more satisfying for that. Room 14 had a different occupant, a post-cardiac ablation patient who required minimal intervention and slept 12 hours out of every 24. Marcus Webb had been transferred to a secure federal medical facility sometime in the afternoon of the day Emily had gone home. She learned this from Okafor in a brief text. "Webb transferred, stable, thank you." 3 sentences. She'd read it 4 times before putting her phone away. The federal presence in the hospital thinned over the following 48 hours as the investigation shifted from containment to prosecution. The agents left. The tactical personnel left. The building went back to being a hospital, which it had always been, which was the point. On the fourth day after that night, the story broke publicly. Emily was at the nursing station when Donna came in on the morning overlap and turned the break room television to a news channel, which she never did. Donna was constitutionally opposed to televisions in break rooms, and so Emily went to see why. The headline across the bottom of the screen read, "Senior DIA official among 9 arrested in federal weapons trafficking investigation." The news anchor was describing the charges in that particular telegraphed cadence of someone reading from a document they haven't fully absorbed. Emily listened to the list of names, Galloway's was third, and the charge descriptions, which included conspiracy, obstruction, misappropriation of classified intelligence, and accessory to attempted murder. The Vantage Meridian CEO's name was 7th on the list. His face appeared on screen, well-dressed, mid-50s, the expression of someone who'd spent years behind the kind of authority that insulates people from consequences. His expression in the arrest photo was the expression of someone who'd discovered the insulation had limits. "Lord," Donna said quietly. Emily watched the screen. A reporter was standing outside a federal building in a city she didn't recognize, gesturing at the entrance, talking about the scope of the investigation. The graphic behind her said, "Estimated $400 million in fraudulent contract awards over 4 years." $400 million. The number was large enough to become abstract. Emily tried to hold on to it in concrete terms. The equipment it would have bought, the personnel it would have funded, the operations it would have supported, and couldn't quite complete the arithmetic. Some numbers communicated more through their weight than their specific value. She watched for another 3 minutes and then went back to her patients, because her patients needed her, and the television was going to keep reporting the same information in cycles regardless of whether she was watching. Over the next 2 weeks, the case expanded. The cooperating agents provided testimony that opened new threads, payments made, communications exchanged, personnel compromised within the federal protective apparatus going back 6 years. The DIA launched an internal investigation. The DOJ announced a joint task force. Congressional committees requested briefings. All of this was reported in overlapping waves of news coverage that Emily mostly experienced as ambient noise, encountered in break rooms and waiting rooms, and on her phone in the quiet moments between patient assessments. She gave her formal statement to federal investigators 12 days after the night in question. It was a 3-hour interview in a conference room at a federal building in Caldwell, conducted by 2 DOJ attorneys and an investigator from the DIA's Inspector General's office. She told them everything she remembered, in order, in the flat clinical detail of someone accustomed to documenting events accurately. They asked her the same questions multiple ways, which was standard practice, and she understood it as such. She answered consistently because her account was consistent. It had happened the way it happened, and she'd been paying attention throughout. At the end of the interview, the lead DOJ attorney set down his pen and said, "Ms. Parker, I want you to understand that your actions that night, particularly your decision to call Deputy Director Okafor and your identification of the unauthorized sedation adjustment, were directly material to the preservation of this prosecution. Without a conscious, capable witness, the documentary evidence, while strong, carried significant legal risk." Emily nodded. "I want to be direct about that," he continued. "You may be asked to testify at trial. We'll be in touch about that possibility." She said she understood, and she was shown out, and she drove back to the hospital because she had a shift in 3 hours, and she wanted to eat something first. The trial possibility didn't materialize quickly. Federal cases rarely did. But the charges held, the indictments proceeded, and in the month following the arrests, 2 of the Vantage Meridian executives entered guilty pleas that, according to the brief news reports Emily read, significantly broadened the evidentiary base for the remaining defendants. Galloway maintained his not guilty position. He was denied bail. His attorneys argued publicly and at length that the evidence against him was circumstantial and politically motivated, using language that the coverage described as aggressive, and that Emily, when she encountered it on her phone one evening, recognized as the posture of someone who understood that his best remaining strategy was delay. Delay required Webb not to testify, which was why, on a Wednesday evening 6 weeks after the night in question, Emily was standing in the parking lot of her apartment building when a man she didn't recognize approached her from a gray car she hadn't noticed in the visitor spaces. He was 40-something, unremarkable, the kind of face that didn't catch the eye. He had his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, which she registered and did not fully relax about, because that combination was itself a practiced presentation. "Ms. Parker," he said, "I have a message from Richard Galloway." She looked at him. She didn't reach for her phone. She kept her hands easy. "I'm listening," she said. "Mr. Galloway understands your position," the man said. He had the careful enunciation of someone delivering a memorized communication. "He understands that you acted with the information available to you. He holds no personal animus." A pause. "He wanted you to know that the people you've aligned yourself with, Okafor, the DIA, have their own interests in this case, interests that are not necessarily aligned with yours." Another pause. "He believes you would benefit from a conversation about the full context of the situation before the trial proceeds." Emily looked at him for a moment. "How did you know where I live?" she said. The man said nothing, which was, itself, an answer. She took out her phone and called Okafor. The man watched her do it. He didn't move. Okafor picked up on the second ring. "I have a man in my parking lot," Emily said. "He says he's carrying a message from Galloway." She looked at the man steadily. "He knows my home address." A brief silence. Then Okafor's voice, flat and immediate. "Don't let him leave. We're sending someone." Emily lowered the phone. "You should stay," she said to the man. "People are coming." Something shifted in the man's expression. A recalculation, quick and visible. He looked at his car, at the exit of the lot, at Emily. "This wasn't supposed to be all," he started. "Stay," Emily said, "or it's a lot worse for you." He stayed. He sat down on the concrete parking block beside his car and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground with the expression of someone who had accepted that the evening had gone badly wrong and was trying to determine exactly where his exposure ended. Okafor's people arrived in 9 minutes. The man was taken into custody and his car was searched, and what they found in the car, a laptop, a folder of printed documents, and a prepaid phone with a call history that would take analysts several hours to fully trace, turned out to be significantly more useful to the prosecution than any conversation he might have facilitated. Emily gave a second statement. This one took 40 minutes. Afterwards, standing outside the federal building while Okafor finished a phone call nearby, Emily thought about what the man had said. "The people you've aligned yourself with have their own interests," which was true. Okafor had interests, the DIA had interests, the DOJ had interests, and none of those interests were identical to Emily's, and she wasn't naive enough to think they were. That was not the same as those interests being in opposition to the right outcome. Galloway's play had been to introduce doubt, to make Emily uncertain enough to become passive, to create the possibility that she might become unavailable as a witness through the slower, quieter mechanism of confusion rather than the direct one of threat. It was, she thought, a more sophisticated version of what his fake doctor had tried with a syringe 6 weeks ago. Different instrument, same objective. She called Vasquez that night. "He tried to flip you," Vasquez said when Emily had laid out the parking lot encounter. "He tried to create distance. I think flipping would have been a secondary objective." Emily was sitting on her couch with her second cup of coffee, which she was aware was not a good choice at 9 in the evening, but was making anyway. "He's trying to reduce the witness count before trial, which means the case is making him nervous. Or his attorneys are." "Same thing," Vasquez said. Emily was quiet for a moment. Outside, her neighborhood made its normal sounds. Traffic, a dog somewhere, the specific urban acoustic she'd stopped consciously hearing years ago. "Vasquez, how solid is Webb?" A pause. Not hesitation. Vasquez didn't hesitate. A consideration. "Solid," Vasquez said. "He's recovered better than the medical people expected. He's been debriefed. He's working with the prosecution team directly." Another pause. "He asked about you." Emily hadn't expected that. She sat with it for a moment. What did he ask? Whether you were all right, whether you were going to testify. A beat. Whether anyone had given you trouble. And? I told him 2 of 3. Emily almost smiled. The parking lot guy. I figured you'd tell him yourself eventually. She finished her coffee. She looked at her phone, at the cracked screen she'd never gotten repaired, the fracture running diagonally across the upper right corner, a detail so familiar now she'd stopped seeing it. When's the trial date set? She asked. Preliminary hearings start in 6 weeks. The trial itself. Vasquez paused. Prosecution is pushing for 8 months. Defense will drag. Realistically, you're looking at 12 to 14 months before it's in front of a jury. A year. Maybe more. Emily set the phone down after they hung up and sat in the quiet of her apartment and thought about that. About what it meant to be a witness in a case like this for a year. The low-grade particular weight of having something unresolved that existed alongside the normal forward motion of a life. She went to work the next morning. She pulled a double because someone called out sick. She managed a post-surgical patient in near respiratory failure for 3 hours before he stabilized, and it required everything she had, every drug, every assessment call, every controlled decision under pressure. And when he was stable and breathing and his numbers were coming up, she felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, simply like herself. That was the work. That was what she'd come back to civilian medicine to do, and it was still here, unchanged and demanding, asking everything of her the way it always had. She was charting at the end of the shift, in the early morning again, a different early morning, quiet and ordinary, when her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize, area code she couldn't place. She answered. Parker? A voice she knew, rough at the edges, the particular texture of vocal cords that had spent several weeks healing from a ventilator tube. Webb, she said. A silence, not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people who understood each other at a specific register and didn't need to fill it. How's the floor? He said. Busy. You? Getting there. A pause. I heard about the parking lot. Vasquez. Yeah. Another pause. I wanted to... He stopped. She heard him recalibrate. I'm not good at this part. You don't have to be. No, A brief exhaled sound. I wanted to say thank you. Directly. Not through a chain. Emily looked at the nursing station in front of her, at the monitor screens, the medication charts, the cup of cold coffee she'd been not drinking for an hour, at the ordinary machinery of the work. You already did, she said, in the room, when you were extubated. I said, okay. I know what you meant. Another silence. Longer this time. They're going to push for your testimony, he said. The prosecution, they told me. I know. It'll be public, press. Your name. A pause that felt careful. I wanted you to be ready for that. She thought about being ready for it, about what that meant, about the difference between the version of this that she'd imagined, if she'd imagined anything, and the version that was actually unfolding, with its legal timelines and its parking lot encounters and its year of waiting. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Webb was quiet. Then, neither am I. She hung up and finished her chart and drove home in the morning light, and she didn't yet know about the sealed filing that had been submitted to the federal court the previous afternoon by Galloway's defense team, a motion that, if granted, would have significant consequences for the prosecution's timeline and for Emily's status as a witness. She didn't know that yet. She would know by 9 a.m. when Okafor called. Okafor called at 8:47 a.m. Emily had been home for 40 minutes. She'd taken off her shoes, put water on for coffee, and sat down on the couch with the specific intention of not doing anything for at least an hour. She was looking at the ceiling when the phone buzzed. Tell me, Emily said. Galloway's defense team filed a motion yesterday afternoon, Okafor said. Sealed. We got access to it an hour ago. A pause that was slightly longer than Okafor's pauses usually were. They're filing to have your testimony excluded on the grounds that you operated outside the scope of your professional authority on the night in question. that your actions constituted unauthorized interference in a federal operation, and that the evidence chain originating from your observations is therefore procedurally compromised. Emily sat with that. They're trying to exclude my testimony, she said. Trying to exclude your testimony and create grounds for excluding Webb's physical extubation timeline from the record, because you performed it before our medical officer arrived. Another pause. It's a long shot. Our attorneys think it's a long shot, but it creates a delay, which is what Galloway needs, and if it gains any traction at the preliminary hearing, it complicates things. When's the preliminary hearing? 6 days. Emily looked at the water beginning to move in the pot on her stove. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing yet. I wanted you to know before you read it somewhere else. Okafor's voice had the quality of someone delivering information they wished they didn't have to deliver. Our attorneys are preparing a response. The argument is straightforward. You were the nurse of record on that floor. The patient was in your care. Every action you took fell within your scope of professional practice and your duty of care. The fact that a federal operation was occurring simultaneously does not retroactively redefine your professional obligations. That's correct, Emily said. Yes, Okafor said. It is. The water was boiling. Emily got up and poured it and didn't taste the coffee when she drank it. The next 6 days were the slowest of the entire stretch. She went to work. She came home. She ran, which she hadn't done consistently in months, because the movement helped with the thing that was happening in her chest. Not quite anxiety, not quite anger, something between them that needed a physical outlet, or it would sit there and calcify. She ran 4 miles the first morning and 5 the second, and couldn't get past 3 on the third because her body was still carrying the accumulated debt of the night she'd been operating on fright and adrenaline, and it was collecting. She called her sister in Portland on the 4th day. Her sister Dara was 6 years older and had 2 kids and a mortgage and a very specific understanding of Emily, which was that Emily didn't call unless she needed to talk and didn't talk directly about what she needed to talk about. You sound tired, Dara said. I am. Work? Something related to work. Dara let a silence sit for a moment, the comfortable kind. Are you okay? Emily thought about what that meant. Whether she was okay? She was not, she decided, in any particular danger. She was not grieving anything. She was frustrated, which was different, and the frustration had a sharp, specific edge because it was directed at the machinery of a system that she understood well enough to know was working as designed, slowly, adversarially, grinding, and that its grinding was Galloway's last remaining weapon. I'm fine, she said. I just wanted to talk. They talked for 40 minutes about Dara's older kid's soccer season and whether Dara's husband's work situation was improving, and a television show Dara was watching that Emily had never seen. Normal, peripheral, the kind of conversation that anchors a person to their actual life when their actual life has been partially displaced by something large and unresolved. It helped. Not completely. Enough. The preliminary hearing was held on a Thursday. Emily was not required to attend, but Okafor texted her a 2-sentence summary at 4:17 p.m. Motion denied. Full. Galloway's team is appealing, but we don't anticipate it affecting the trial date. Emily read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and finished her shift. The appeal went nowhere. The trial date held. In the months that followed, the strange, attenuated months of legal procedure, of continuances and hearings, and the periodic surfacing of developments that were reported by the press with varying degrees of accuracy, Emily's life had the texture of 2 separate realities running in parallel. There was the hospital, which was constant and demanding, and hers in the way work is yours when you're good at it, and it takes everything you have. And there was the other thing, the waiting, which ran underneath the work like a low-frequency sound you stop consciously hearing but never stop feeling in your bones. Webb called occasionally. Not often, 3 or 4 times over the course of those months. The calls were not long, and they were not personal in any way Emily could have clearly articulated. He asked about the floor, about Reeves, about whether the DOJ attorneys had been in contact. She asked how his recovery was progressing, whether the prosecution prep was wearing on him, what he was doing with the time. Reading, he said once. Apparently I have a backlog. Of what? Everything I put off for 22 months. She understood that. The things you defer when you're inside something all-consuming, the small textures of a normal life that accumulate in a waiting pile. Not forgotten, just suspended. Reeves called once, briefly, to thank her. He was back on light duty. He sounded young and slightly formal and genuinely grateful in the uncomplicated way of someone who understood that the appropriate response to having your life preserved was direct acknowledgement. She told him she was glad he was upright and meant it. Donna retired in month 4 of the waiting period. 31 years, a small party in the break room with sheet cake and a speech from the nursing director that made 3 people cry. Emily was there. She hugged Donna in the parking lot afterward, and Donna said, "You're the best nurse I've worked with in a decade and you're going to be fine," in the particular Donna way that made statements sound like medical assessments. Emily believed her. The trial began on a Tuesday in early spring, 14 months after the night in question. Emily gave her testimony on the 6th day of proceedings in a federal courtroom in Caldwell that was smaller than she'd expected and more formal than anything she'd been in before. She wore dark clothes. She sat straight. She answered the prosecution's questions in the measured, factual cadence of her formal statement, times, observations, actions, outcomes, and then sat through the defense attorney's cross-examination, which lasted an hour and 40 minutes, and was structured around the same argument the pretrial motion had made, that her actions had been outside her authority, that her observations were colored by presumption, that her military background had caused her to misread a legitimate federal operation. She answered every question with the same flat precision. Yes or no when yes or no was correct. Detailed when detail was warranted. She did not get angry. She did not become defensive. She had been talking to juries, in one form or another, for her entire nursing career, giving testimony in incident reviews, defending clinical decisions, explaining to families in plain language what had happened to someone they loved. And she understood that the most powerful thing she could do in a room where someone was trying to undermine her account was to remain completely, immovably herself. After the cross-examination, the defense attorney said, "Nothing further." He said it with the clipped precision of someone closing a line of argument that had not gone the way they'd planned. Emily stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to the gallery, and she did not look at Galloway. She had not looked at him at all during her testimony. She'd been asked to describe his actions, and she'd described them, but she'd directed her answers to the jury and the attorneys and the judge. She didn't have anything to say to him that a courtroom was the right venue for, and the discipline of not looking at him had required some effort, and she was glad she'd spent it that way. She felt his eyes on her when she sat down. She picked up her phone and looked at nothing on the screen and waited for the next witness to be called. The trial lasted 4 weeks total. During that time, 11 people testified for the prosecution. Marcus Webb testified on the 3rd week, day 2, and his testimony, which Emily heard about from Vasquez afterward because she wasn't in the courtroom for it, lasted 3 days. 3 days of detailed, documented account of 22 months inside a criminal procurement apparatus. Every meeting, every transaction, every name, every figure. The particular granular weight of someone who had been keeping score for a very long time and was finally allowed to put the numbers down. One of the Vantage Meridian executives who had taken a plea deal testified the following day and corroborated Webb's account at 3 critical points. The defense cross-examined him for most of a day. His account held. Galloway did not testify. His attorneys had clearly advised him against it, which was the correct advice, and also the advice of someone who understood that their client could not withstand direct questioning with the documentary record that existed. Emily was at work when the jury went out. She was managing a 60-year-old patient with post-surgical cardiac arrhythmia when Vasquez texted her, "Jury deliberating as of 9 a.m." She acknowledged it with a thumbs up and went back to her patient, because her patient needed her regardless of what a jury in a federal courthouse was doing. The deliberations took 31 hours over 4 days. She was not at the hospital when the verdict came in. She was at home on a Saturday morning doing laundry, the most ordinary possible thing, when her phone rang. Vasquez. "Guilty," Vasquez said. "All counts, all defendants." Emily sat down on the floor next to her washing machine, not because her legs gave out, because it felt like the right response to gravity. "All of them," she said. Galloway, both supervisors, 4 Vantage Meridian executives, and the assassin. The hired man who came in with the syringe, he took a plea 2 months ago. You didn't hear that yet. He gets a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony, but he's still going away for a long time. Vasquez's voice was steadier than the information warranted, but that was Vasquez. She processed things at a frequency that most people couldn't see and presented only the output. Sentencing is scheduled for 60 days out. The DOJ is pushing for maximum on Galloway. Emily looked at the wall of her laundry room, at the paint, which was a beige she'd always intended to change and never had, at the small chip near the baseboard she'd been meaning to touch up. How long? She said. Galloway? Prosecution is recommending 42 years. 42 years. He was 53. The math on that was its own verdict. The supervisors? 18 and 22, respectively. The Vantage executives are in the 12 to 18 range, depending on their individual counts. Vasquez paused. The CEO is looking at the top of that range. His attorney is already filing sentencing objections, but given the scope of what he participated in, the judge is unlikely to be sympathetic. Emily stood up. She finished moving the laundry into the dryer because she had it in her hands and the task was in front of her. She started the dryer. She stood in the warm vibration of it for a moment. Vasquez, she said. Yeah. Thank you for taking my call. That night. A pause. You'd have figured it out without me. Maybe. Not as fast. Probably not as fast, Vasquez conceded. But Parker, you were the one in the room. You were the one between the patient and everything that came through that door. Another pause. That's not nothing. That's not even close to nothing. Emily hung up and called Dara. She didn't explain everything. She said there was a thing that had been resolved, a work situation that had been going on for a long time and was now finished. Dara, who had been waiting for this call in her own way, having absorbed enough from their Portland conversation and the subsequent ones to understand the broad shape of what her sister had been carrying, simply said, "Good, I'm glad." Then she said, "Can you come visit?" Emily looked at her calendar. She had 2 weeks of accumulated leave that her charge had been gently and then less gently suggesting she take for 3 months. "Yeah," she said, "next month. Bring nothing work-related. I'll try." "Emily, I'll try hard." The sentencing hearing was 8 weeks after the verdict. Emily attended. She was not required to. She had not been required to do most of the things she had done in connection with this case, and she did them anyway, which was a pattern she recognized in herself without being able to entirely explain. The federal courthouse was different at a sentencing than it was at a trial. Quieter somehow. More compressed. The procedural element of a trial, the evidence, the testimony, the sustained adversarial performance of it, was over. What remained was consequence. She sat in the gallery. She looked at Galloway when they brought him in, which she hadn't done during her testimony. She looked at him the way she'd looked at situations on her floor, directly, without performance, trying to see what was actually there. He was thinner than he'd been. The months of pretrial detention had taken some of the polished authority from him, or maybe just made the thing underneath it more visible. He sat at the defense table with his attorneys, and he looked straight ahead, and he did not look at the gallery. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with the contained, precise manner of someone who had been making consequential decisions for a long time and had calibrated herself to the weight of that, read through the sentencing framework with careful deliberateness. The charges, the findings, the sentencing guidelines, the prosecution's recommendation. She sentenced Galloway to 38 years, not the 42 the prosecution had recommended. 38. The distinction was technical, the result of specific guideline calculations. It did not, in any practical sense, change what 38 years meant for a 53-year-old man. The two supervisors received 20 and 17 years respectively. The 4 Vantage Meridian executives received sentences ranging from 14 to 21 years. The CEO, who had maintained through sentencing that he had been unaware of the criminality of his company's intelligence procurement, received 19 years, which the judge noted was a reflection of the scope of harm caused and the sustained nature of his participation. The hired assassin, the man in the white coat who had come into room 14 with a syringe and a gun, and the particular calm of someone who'd done this before, He received 23 years under his plea agreement, reduced from the maximum he would have faced at trial. 23 years for attempted murder and federal conspiracy. He was let out with the same controlled composure he'd worn in the hospital room, which was either the lack of remorse of a man who'd long ago separated himself from the human consequences of his work, or the trained discipline of someone who'd decided not to give the room the satisfaction of watching him break. Emily watched them all let out. She remained in her seat until the courtroom had substantially cleared, a hand on her shoulder. She looked up. Okafor. The deputy director sat down beside her in the gallery, in the emptying courtroom, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Outside the tall windows, the city was doing what cities do, moving, indifferent, the accumulated ordinary life of people who would never know what had happened in a hospital ICU 14 months ago and were not diminished for not knowing. "How do you feel?" Okafor said. Emily considered the question seriously, the way Okafor asked everything. "Like something is finished. Is that good?" "I think so." Emily looked at the front of the room, at the now empty defense table. "I expected to feel more. I don't know what exactly. Something larger." "Justice usually doesn't feel the way we imagine it will," Okafor said. She said it without the weight of a lesson, just as an observation. "It feels like relief, maybe, but a quiet one. Because what it actually is an absence. The thing that was wrong is now corrected. There's no positive feeling that attaches to that, just the absence of the weight." Emily thought about that. About the weight she'd been carrying for 14 months. Not consciously, mostly, not as something she named and attended to, but present. The way chronic pain is present, coloring everything slightly without declaring itself as the reason. She felt it lift, or begin to. It was not a sudden thing. It was more like the change in pressure when you leave a room that has been subtly wrong in its air circulation. You don't notice it fully until you're out. "There's something else," Okafor said. Emily looked at her. Okafor reached into the leather folder she'd set on the seat beside her and produced an envelope. Not official looking, not a government envelope. Standard white, sealed, with Emily's name written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. "Webb asked me to give you this," Okafor said. "He wanted to be here. He's not cleared for public appearances yet, given the ongoing security reassessment of everyone associated with the case." She paused. His words, about the letter, were, "She can read it or not, but I wanted her to have it." Emily took the envelope. She didn't open it in the courthouse. She drove home first, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table in the afternoon light, and opened it. The handwriting was deliberate and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone who wrote rarely and by hand almost never, and who had taken real care with this. "Parker, I've been trying to write this for 4 months. The drafts I've thrown away would fill a folder. I'm going to try to be as direct as I know how to be, which apparently is not as direct as I thought. I was conscious longer than I let on that night. Not fully. Most of it was behind glass, the way sedation works. But I heard you in the doorway. I heard what you said. I felt someone put themselves between me and the door. I didn't know who you were or why you were doing it, and I was in no position to help or refuse or respond. I just knew someone was there. When I was in the worst of it, the 22 months, I had this thing I did when I needed to get through the next hour. I told myself that somewhere there was at least one person who was doing the right thing without being asked to. That the math of the world wasn't entirely against decency. It sounds too simple to be useful, and it worked anyway, which is one of the things I've learned to stop arguing with. You were that person. Before I knew your name, before I was conscious enough to understand what was happening, you were that. I don't know how to repay that kind of thing. I'm not sure it's repayable. So I'm just saying it plainly instead. Thank you for staying in the room. For all of it. Webb. P.S. Vasquez tells me you still haven't gotten your phone screen fixed. Fix your phone. Emily set the letter down. She sat at the table for a long time in the quiet of her apartment, with the afternoon moving slowly through the window and the ordinary sounds of her street below. She was not crying. She was something more complicated than that, some combination of exhaustion and recognition and the specific feeling of understanding that something she'd done in the dark without knowing its full weight, had mattered in ways she couldn't have measured at the time. She thought about what he'd written, about the person doing the right thing without being asked to. She'd never thought of it that way, had never, in the room that night, conceptualized herself as doing anything more than her job, the job she'd been trained to do twice over, in two different disciplines, both of which had taught her the same core principle. You do not leave the patient. You hold what you can hold. You do not abandon the work. That was all she'd done. But the thing she was learning, slowly, over 14 months of watching the consequences unfold, was that all was sometimes the wrong word for it. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Emily received a letter on official stationery from the Commanding General of the Army Medical Command, which she read standing in her building's lobby and then read again sitting on the stairs. The letter commended her actions on the night in question. It acknowledged her service as a combat medic. It expressed, in the formal but genuine language of official military correspondence, something that she would have dismissed as bureaucratic boilerplate in a different context, but which, in this context, landed with the weight of something true. It said, among other things, that the actions of Sergeant First Class Emily Parker, retired, reflected the values and training of the Army Medical Corps and brought credit upon herself and her service. She had not been Sergeant First Class anything for 3 years. She had been Emily Parker, RN, night shift, 4th floor ICU, Harwick Memorial Medical Center. It turned out those two things were not as separate as she'd sometimes told herself. The formal recognition came in late summer. A ceremony at Caldwell City Hall, not the federal building, the city's own civic auditorium, because Okafor had apparently decided that the scope of what had been prevented warranted a public acknowledgement in the city where it had happened, and the mayor had agreed, and the hospital had agreed, and a number of other people had agreed in the particular cascade that happens when enough authoritative voices are telling the same story in the same direction. Emily found out 3 days before it happened. Okafor called to tell her, and Emily said she didn't need a ceremony, and Okafor said that was noted but irrelevant, and Emily said she didn't know what she was supposed to wear to something like this, and Okafor told her to wear whatever she was comfortable in, and Emily wore dark slacks and a blazer she hadn't had occasion to wear in 2 years and got a stitch out of her left shoulder sleeve because it had come loose and she only noticed in the car. The auditorium was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd thought, if she'd thought about it at all, which she'd tried not to. Maybe 100 people, a formal room, something quick and procedural. There were several hundred people, and it was not quick, and nothing about it felt procedural. The mayor spoke. The hospital's executive director spoke. Okafor spoke. A representative from the Army Medical Command read from a citation. A representative from the DOJ said something about the role of individual courage in systemic accountability. Deputy Marshal Reeves was there, in his uniform, walking with a slight hitch in his gait that he would probably always have. He caught Emily's eye from across the room and gave her a nod that carried the full weight of what had happened in that doorway, and the very good fortune of him being alive to give it. Donna was there, in a red blouse, sitting 3 rows from the front, arms crossed and expression carefully neutral, which was Donna's version of being moved. She gave Emily a look that communicated, without words, that she thought all of this was excessive and correct in equal measure. Vasquez stood near the back. She was in civilian clothes, which was somewhat unusual, and she gave Emily a single precise nod when Emily spotted her. The nod of one person to another who knows what the work actually cost. Marcus Webb was there. She saw him before she went up to the stage, across the auditorium, in a seat near the aisle, wearing a civilian jacket and looking like someone who had recovered from significant physical trauma and was still partway through the recovery. He was thinner than the sedated patient she'd managed in room 14, and there was a specific alertness in his posture that she recognized, the posture of someone accustomed to reading a room for exits. He saw her see him. He gave her the same small nod he'd given in the hospital bed when she'd said the corridor was clear. She gave him the same nod back. When her name was called, she walked to the stage. She stood at the podium with the medal, a formal federal commendation, the physical weight of it surprising and oddly grounding in her palm, and looked out at the room. She had not prepared remarks. She'd been told she could say whatever she wanted, that the program allowed for it, and she'd decided in the car that she would figure it out when she got there, which was how she made most important decisions. She looked at the room, at Donna and Reeves and Vasquez and Webb and the several hundred people she didn't know, at the cameras from 2 local news stations that she was aware of but decided not to think about. I was a combat medic for 4 years, she said, and then I was a nurse. And for a long time I thought of those as 2 separate things. The person I was in the army and the person I became in civilian work. She paused, not for effect, because she was figuring out what she actually thought. I don't think that anymore. I think you carry what you've learned. I think the discipline you build in one hard place shows up in the next one, whether you plan for it or not. She shifted her weight slightly. The microphone was a fraction of an inch too high and she didn't adjust it. What I did that night wasn't heroic. I want to be honest about that. It was trained. I saw something that didn't fit and I followed it because that's what my training told me to do. And then I stayed in a room I probably could have left because that's what my training told me to do. The training isn't glamorous. It's just the accumulation of 1,000 decisions made in less dramatic circumstances. Every shift where you paid attention instead of assuming, every moment where you questioned something instead of deferring to someone with more authority and less information. She paused again. It adds up. When something actually matters, it adds up. She looked down at the medal in her hand for a moment, then back up. There's a federal marshal named Reeves who came back through a door when he heard an alarm and got shot for it. I'd like everyone here to know his name. She didn't look at Reeves when she said it to the room. There's a deputy director named Okafor who took a call from someone she barely knew at 3 a.m. and moved on it without hesitation. There's a charge nurse named Donna Marsh who kept a floor running through something nobody trained her for and made coffee for a federal intelligence officer at 4 a.m., which is the most practical act of support I've ever witnessed. A brief sound from the room, something between a laugh and recognition. There's a man named Marcus Webb who spent 22 months inside something that could have killed him because he believed the record needed to exist. I'm standing here with this medal, and their names are, most of them, not on a stage. She stopped. She felt the thing she always felt at the end of a shift, the specific exhaustion that was also a kind of fullness, the spent resource of having done everything available to do. I refused to leave my patient, she said. That's all I did, and I'd do it again tomorrow. She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment, that particular suspended moment after something has been said that takes a second for the room to process, and then it was not quiet at all. She walked off the stage and Okafor was there, and Okafor extended her hand and Emily shook it, and the deputy director's grip was firm and brief and said, in the shorthand of 2 people who understood each other, everything that needed to be said. Afterward, in the lobby, Donna found her first. Too long, Donna said. Emily looked at her. The speech? The part about me making coffee. But Donna was doing the thing she did when she was trying not to show that she was moved, which was to look at a point slightly above Emily's left shoulder. The rest was fine. High praise, Emily said. Donna hugged her. Briefly, firmly, the hug of a practical woman who had decided a hug was warranted and was executing it without sentimentality. Then she stepped back and said, Come back tonight. Yolanda is good, but you're better. I'll think about it, Emily said. Don't think too long. Webb found her near the door, which was where she'd gravitated, because after a room full of people she needed to be able to see an exit. He moved with the particular deliberateness of someone whose body was still in negotiation with an injury, but he moved without any visible accommodation of it, which told her something about his relationship to physical limitation. He stopped in front of her. They looked at each other. Your phone, he said. She pulled it out. The cracked screen, the diagonal fracture she'd been living with for over a year. I know. It's been 14 months. I've been busy. Emily. He said her first name like he'd used it before, which he hadn't. It didn't sound wrong. Fix the phone. She almost laughed. She caught it before it became an actual laugh, which felt like the right amount of restraint for a civic auditorium lobby with 2 news cameras somewhere nearby. You wrote that you had a backlog, she said, of things you put off. I did. How much of it is cleared? He considered this. Some. The reading is going. A pause. I'm going back in. She looked at him. To work. Different capacity. Okafor's office. Consulting role. He said it with the flat matter-of-factness of someone for whom the work itself was never really the question, only what form it would take. They need people who've been inside the architecture of how these networks operate, who understand the procurement side from the inside. He paused. I'm not going back in the field. I'm done with that part. Are you actually done with it? She asked. Or are you telling yourself you are? He looked at her steadily. I don't know yet, he said. That's an honest answer. She nodded. She respected honest answers significantly more than confident ones. What about you? He said. I'm going to Portland for 2 weeks, she said. My sister's kids. My sister's couch. Her husband makes very good pasta, and I intend to do nothing useful for 14 days. And after that? She thought about Donna's invitation to come back to nights. She thought about her floor, the monitors and the crash carts, and the 3 a.m. clarity of a ward where the work was just the work and every decision had immediate consequence, and there was no distance between the doing and the mattering of it. After that, she said, I go back to my floor. Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he extended his hand, the right one, the one with the trident tattoo that she'd photographed in the dark of room 14 with a cracked phone and filed away as evidence because she'd been paying attention when everyone else had stopped. She shook it. His grip was stronger than it had been on her wrist in the hospital room, recovering, traveling in the right direction. Parker, he said. Webb, she said. He nodded once, precisely, and walked back into the crowd. She stood at the edge of the lobby for a while. The ceremony was breaking up, people drifting toward the exits, the low-frequency noise of a large gathering dispersing into its constituent lives. Outside the tall doors, the late summer city was doing what it always did. Indifferent and continuous, the specific democracy of a city that moves through everything without remembering any of it. She thought about what Okafor had said, that justice feels like an absence, the removal of a wrong rather than the presence of a good. She thought it was more than that, not much more, but something. She thought it felt like standing at the end of a very long shift, when the critical patients had stabilized and the work of the night had been completed and the morning was arriving, gray and ordinary at the edges, nothing cinematic about it, and the particular specific knowledge that the patients in your care were still breathing because you had not looked away. That knowledge didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It lived in the body the same way training did, below the threshold of conscious thought, available when required, the accumulated consequence of 1,000 decisions made in ordinary moments before the extraordinary one arrived. She had spent 31 years learning that she was not someone who looked away. She had spent the last 14 months watching everyone else finally learn it too. She pushed through the doors into the summer afternoon, fixed her blazer, put her cracked phone in her pocket. She would fix the phone in Portland. Or after. It would get fixed eventually. She walked to her car, unlocked it, sat down, and drove through the ordinary streets of Caldwell toward the rest of her life, which was, in every way that mattered, entirely hers.